welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be tackling a concept that might seem a little bit strange at first, the idea of closed-mindedness as a cognitive addiction. We've got a really fascinating AI-generated essay as our jumping-off point for this, and some follow-up questions that really get into what this could all mean.
Yeah, it's definitely a new way to think about things, especially for those of us who spend all our time thinking about cognitive psychology. We're not just talking about the usual stuff like confirmation bias or the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah.
This is about looking at closed-mindedness as kind of like a compulsion, something that's a lot like addiction, even though there's no substance involved.
And that's what makes this so interesting, right? The essay starts by talking about how the American Society of Addiction Medicine defines addiction. And they emphasize that it's not just about substance abuse, but it's more like a chronic disease that affects the reward system and the brain motivation memory, all those circuits.
Mm-hmm.
And when these circuits don't work right, it leads to problems biologically, psychologically, socially, even spiritually. And it shows up as this compulsive need for rewarding stimuli, even when there are bad consequences.
Yeah, exactly. And because the essay starts with this broader definition of addiction, it opens up a whole new way to look at closed-mindedness. It makes us wonder, what if this habit of avoiding any kind of mental discomfort, this clinging to familiar beliefs, even when there's evidence that says they're wrong, what if that fits the definition of addiction?
So instead of just thinking about closed-mindedness as like a personality trait or just a mental shortcut, we're looking at it as maybe a behavioral addiction, something that's driven by this need to feel comfortable in our own minds. That really changes the way we usually think about it.
Definitely. And to really explain this, the essay gets into the science. It talks about a part of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC. It's a really important part of the brain for noticing when we make mistakes or when things don't add up. And it helps us update our beliefs when we get new information.
Right. And we know that when the ACC isn't working as well as it should, people tend to be less flexible in their thinking, and they have a harder time changing their beliefs even when they need to.
Yeah.
So are we saying that in people who are prone to closed-mindedness, this error detection system is just not working as well, so they just keep holding on to their old beliefs?
That's a big part of the argument. The essay compares this weaker ACC activity to what happens in the brains of people with addiction. You know how their habits become so ingrained that they can't change them? It's like the brain's reward system is giving them positive reinforcement to keep using substances. And it might be doing the same thing in closed-mindedness. It might be reinforcing that avoidance of anything that makes them feel mentally uncomfortable.
Which makes sense when you think about how much it can hurt to have our beliefs challenged. It's almost like we're programmed to seek out that feeling of comfort, of knowing we're right and having our beliefs backed up.
Exactly. And the essay takes it even further. It says that closed-mindedness isn't just about avoiding being uncomfortable. It's about actually searching for comfort in our thoughts.
Okay.
This sounds a lot like cravings in addiction. You know how people with addiction have this strong desire for the feeling they get from the substance?
So in this case, the person with a closed mind is basically craving that feeling of validation that comes from having their worldview confirmed. It's like they're addicted to that dopamine hit that comes from feeling right and having their beliefs reinforced.
Exactly. The essay points out that this drive for cognitive comfort activates the same reward circuits in the brain, those dopamine pathways that are involved in substance addiction, and that creates this powerful cycle. The more we look for information that confirms what we already believe, the stronger those beliefs become, and the harder it is to even consider other perspectives.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The closed mind creates its own little world where everything confirms what it already believes. But this makes me wonder, how does this cognitive addiction start in the first place? We're not born with our worldviews already set, are we?
No, of course not. And that's where the essay gets really interesting. It says that the roots of closed-mindedness often start growing when we're young, shaped by what happens to us as kids, how our society teaches us to think, and even how we learn to deal with feeling uncomfortable.
So we're talking about those early experiences with feeling ashamed or guilty or embarrassed. Those times when we might have been punished for speaking up or questioning things.
Exactly. The essay says that if we don't handle those early experiences in a healthy way, if we don't learn good ways to deal with the mental discomfort of having our beliefs challenged, we might start to connect challenging ideas with those negative feelings. And that sets us up to avoid anything that threatens our comfortable little world of beliefs for the rest of our lives.
It makes you wonder if for some people those early bad experiences with having their beliefs challenged actually create a kind of aversion to it, just like how some people develop a taste aversion after just one bad experience with a certain food.
That's a really good analogy. And it highlights just how powerful those early experiences can be. They can really affect how our minds develop. And what's maybe most sneaky about this is that because it often starts so early, it just becomes normal. It becomes part of who we are.
So by the time we're adults, this need to protect our beliefs at all costs is so ingrained that we don't even see it as a problem. We just think it's part of our personality.
That's a really important point. The essay argues that this normalization, combined with the fact that there aren't any obvious physical withdrawal symptoms like you see in substance addiction, might be why we haven't really thought of closed-mindedness as a potential cognitive disease before. It's not like drug addiction, where you can often see the physical damage it's doing. It's more subtle, but it could be just as damaging to our lives and relationships. And this brings up a really tough question that we're going to talk about more in the next part. If closed-mindedness is like an addiction, does that mean it's something we have to struggle with our whole lives? Is it even possible to have a recovered mind? That's what we'll be talking about when we come back for part 2 of this deep dive.
So welcome back. Let's dig a little deeper into this comparison between addiction to substances and this idea of closed-mindedness as a cognitive addiction. Like we were saying before, is this something people struggle with their whole lives?
Yeah, it's a question a lot of us think about in our work. How much control do people really have when it comes to these thought patterns that are so deeply ingrained? The essay makes this kind of unsettling comparison to the idea that once an addict, always an addict.
Right. The essay suggests that even if we really try to open our minds, those pathways in our brains, those habits, they can come back. Especially when someone challenges something we believe in really strongly or when we're feeling stressed. It's a little scary when you think about it. It is, because it means that even if someone makes a lot of progress, there's always a chance they could fall back into old patterns. This really shows how important it is to have ways to keep our minds flexible, to resist going back to those comfortable ways of thinking, even if they're holding us back.
You know, I think that Andy makes a really important point here. It's not about getting rid of those ingrained patterns completely. That's probably not going to happen. It's more about recognizing they're there and learning how to deal with them. It's kind of like becoming more aware of what our own minds are doing and how they're biased.
So instead of trying to be perfectly open-minded, which is probably impossible, it's more about knowing our weaknesses, those things that might make us fall back into closed-minded thinking.
Exactly. And that leads to another interesting question. What does a recovered mind even look like? If we're using this addiction model, how do we even describe that?
Yeah, and thankfully the essay doesn't just leave us with all doom and gloom. It actually gives us a pretty good picture of what this less closed-minded state could look like. It talks about being flexible in our thinking, being able to regulate our emotions, being interested in learning new things.
And something that's really important, having a humble view of ourselves and being okay with things being complicated and ambiguous. This reminds me of a lot of the work being done on intellectual humility and being able to consider lots of different viewpoints at the same time without feeling threatened.
It makes you realize that a recovered mind in this context isn't just about being open to new ideas. It's also about being okay with not knowing everything, being comfortable with uncertainty. It's about embracing the process of learning and changing, even if it means admitting we were wrong.
I think that's a big part of it, shifting from needing to be right to wanting to understand. It's about not being so focused on defending our beliefs and instead being more curious about the world and open to being surprised.
It's almost like seeing the whole process of learning as a journey, not a destination. But I'm also curious about the practical side of this. Like, how much of a difference does this mitigation actually make in someone's life? Can we measure the benefits?
Actually, the essay talks about that. It mentions research on emotional regulation and cognitive flexibility training and suggests that people can actually reduce their emotional reactivity by like 50 to 70%. That's huge.
Wow, that's a really impressive number.
Yeah.
But for someone listening to this who maybe works with clients or patients who struggle with these issues, what does that actually look like in their everyday lives?
Think about it this way. Less conflict with other people, less stress and anxiety, better decisions, and they're less likely to be manipulated or get caught up in all the polarization happening in society. It's about having more stability inside no matter what's happening around them.
So it's not just about being more open-minded as a person. It's about becoming more resilient and being able to navigate the world with more clarity and purpose. It's about living a better life without being weighed down by all that reactivity and defensiveness.
Exactly. And it challenges this common idea that closed-mindedness is just an inevitable part of being human, something that evolution hardwired into our brains so we could survive.
Right, like the idea that our ancestors needed these mental shortcuts, these biases, to make quick decisions when they were in danger. But the essay argues that this view is too simplistic, doesn't it?
It does. It says that while those biases might have come from our evolutionary past, how much they affect us today depends on a lot of other things. What happens to us in childhood, how other people reinforce our beliefs, the stories our culture tells us, the constant flood of information in the digital age.
And of course, the way our brains get used to thinking in certain patterns, those neural pathways that make it so easy to fall back into old ways of thinking, even when we know they might not be right.
Exactly. And this different perspective is really important because it suggests that we might have more control over closed-mindedness than we thought. It's not just about accepting our limitations, it's about understanding where those limitations come from and finding ways to work with them to actually rewire those pathways in our brains over time.
It's a much more hopeful view, one that focuses on our ability to change and grow. But it also makes you wonder, if we can change, why is it so hard for people, and even society as a whole, to really admit that closed-mindedness is a problem? Why are we so resistant to seeing it?
That's a really important question. And it's one we're going to explore more in the next part. We'll also talk about what this model might mean for how we deal with disagreements, debates, and even education in a world where everything seems so polarized and there's so much information coming at us all the time.
All right, so we're back. And now that we've kind of set the stage, let's get to that question we left off with. Why is it so hard for us to see closed-mindedness and do something about it, both in ourselves and, like, as a society?
Yeah, it's a question that gets at the heart of how we see ourselves and how we interact with each other. The essay brings up a few psychological and sociological reasons why we might resist this idea.
And one of those obvious ones is cognitive dissonance, right? That need we all have to keep a consistent image of ourselves and avoid anything that makes us feel like our beliefs are contradictory.
Exactly. If we think of ourselves as rational, open-minded people, admitting that we might be closed-minded can create a lot of dissonance. It threatens how we see ourselves, and that's a really strong motivator to just avoid the issue altogether.
It's much easier to see those negative qualities in other people, right? To think of them as the closed-minded ones while we get to hold on to this belief that we're objective.
And that's where in-group bias comes in. The essay talks about how we're much more likely to excuse biases in our own group, even if we recognize that bias is a problem in general.
So we basically make exceptions for ourselves and the people we identify with, reinforcing this idea that we're the rational ones and they're the ones stuck in their own little bubble.
Exactly. And this happens on a bigger scale, too, like in politics, where each side thinks the other side is closed-minded but can't see it in themselves.
It's like this never-ending cycle of blame and judgment that makes it impossible to have any real conversation or understanding.
And then there's the diffusion of responsibility. The essay says that we often assume someone else is going to take care of the problem, like teachers or politicians or some authority figure.
It's like the bystander effect, but with ideas. Everyone sees the problem, but nobody feels like it's their job to fix it.
And this connects to another idea, systemic attribution. We tend to blame things outside of ourselves, institutions, the system, whatever, for causing closed-mindedness, instead of looking at ourselves and admitting that we might be part of the problem too.
It's always easier to point fingers than to look at our own beliefs and behaviors.
I know.
But this brings up something I've been wondering about. If this essay makes such a strong case for thinking of closed-mindedness as a cognitive addiction, why would experts in psychology, people who study these things all the time, have a hard time accepting this idea?
That's a good question. And the essay acknowledges that this framework is going to be controversial, even among psychologists. One reason is that it's hard to define addiction itself. Expanding the definition to include something like closed-mindedness, a thought process, might seem like we're stretching the concept too far or making something normal into a disease.
Right, there's this worry about turning everything into a medical problem, and calling closed-mindedness a disease could make people feel stigmatized, or like we're ignoring all the social and cultural things that contribute to these ways of thinking.
Exactly. And there are practical things to think about, too. If we accept this new model, it could change how research is funded, how we treat people, and even how we approach education and conversations in society. It would require a pretty big shift in how we think and what we prioritize.
It's almost like we're talking about a whole new way of understanding how our minds work. And those kinds of big changes are never easy. They often meet resistance from people who are comfortable with the way things already are.
True. But even if this cognitive addiction model doesn't become widely accepted right away, it brings up important questions that we need to think about. It makes us question our ideas about free will responsibility and our ability to change.
It forces us to come up with new ways to deal with closed-mindedness, both individually and as a society.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe by understanding how it works in our brains, the neural pathways, the reward systems, we can find better ways to help people become more flexible in their thinking and create a world that's more open-minded and less divided.
I think that's the main point here. The essay is meant to be thought-provoking, not the final word. It's an invitation to look at things from a new perspective, to have a deeper, more nuanced conversation about what closed-mindedness really is and how it affects our lives.
It's about realizing that even though we might have certain biases, we're not stuck with them. We can learn, grow, and create a world where curiosity, empathy, and intellectual humility are valued. And that's a goal worth working towards, even if it's hard and complicated.
I agree. And maybe the most important message for our listeners is this: the power of simply being aware. Recognizing that the first step to change is to understand ourselves and the things that shape how we think and act.
This deep dive has really made us think. And like always, we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, have thoughtful conversations, and never stop questioning, learning, and growing.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep those minds open and stay curious.